Welcome to Prison Professors. My name is Michael Santos. I'm really enthusiastic every time I have an opportunity to bring a leader into prisons so that people can listen and learn. It's such a big challenge out here in society to find a job, and that's the reason that we have our course, Preparing for Success After Prison, is we want to show people strategies they can use regardless of what the prison system is doing. Prison system isn't always going to make things easier for you, so it's crucial that every individual learns how to develop skills and resources that will help themselves so they can create their own jobs. And today we get to listen to a real job creator. Phil, thank you so much for carving time out of your busy schedule to spend with us today. Why don't you tell our audience, if it's okay, just a little bit about the business that you built so they know who you are and what you do, and then we'll back up and kind of talk about how you got here. Is that okay?
That's fine. Well, originally, Michael, I put myself through law school in the insurance business, and I had enough success that I couldn't practice law when I left because I couldn't afford to take the pay cut. Um, I eventually did go into the practice of law. I was an anti-government attorney for several years, uh, creating the ire of an unlimited amount of judges and politicians. When I left that, I was actually invited to leave by the bar because I had called a chief judge in a very major city a crook. Turns out he was a crook. He was resigned under FBI investigation a couple of years later, but they did not give me an award for being psychic or correct. I went back into the insurance business and became the number one producer in the sales of annuities in the United States, documented in a very short time, and built a very large agency and distribution center. Uh, I came to the attention of the state because I was so high profile on behalf of the industry. I helped beat the Securities and Exchange Commission in one of the most important cases of the industry where they tried to make insurance a security, and it was my brief that disallowed that. So I became a targeted through that, and administratively, not criminally. And the government sought to destroy the business a couple of times over. I rebuilt it a couple of times. At my high, I had in the mid 40s employees doing millions and millions of dollars a year in commissions and business. And at the end, I had placed in a very short time almost $1 billion in life insurance coverage, a lot of which is still in effect. And I've trained, I wrote a book about retirement planning. I've trained hundreds of agents, a lot of whom are extremely successful throughout the country. Uh, and they're still in business today.
So let's that first of all, congratulations on being so self-directed and recognizing or really being a model for those 9 words that Ronald Reagan told us all about, that the government is not the what is it, the worst thing you want to hear is that I'm with the government and I'm here to help. So it's one of the things we talk about in our course is that people really need to learn how to sow seeds for success regardless of external circumstances or what's going on in their life. And clearly you're an individual who has done that. And I think a lot of the people in our audience are also coming from a background that they may feel targeted. I always just like to show people, hey, we have to live in the world as it exists. And if you could help me convey that lesson, I think we'd be doing a great service to people in prison who need to learn how to develop their own skills. So could you tell us a little bit about, I mean, what was it like growing up? When you were growing up, did you have aspirations of going to law school, or what kind of student were you as a young kid?
I'm going to tell you that, but I want to make a reference to the being targeted, if you don't mind.
Okay.
One of the best days of my life was I did some marketing work for the great singer Tony Bennett. I left my heart in San Francisco. Tony marched at Selma with Dr. King. And I was lucky enough, he introduced me to Coretta Scott King. And I spent an afternoon with her one on one, and she gave me a personal tour of the King Center. Dr. King is one of my great heroes. And I would remind everybody that as part of his movement, he was targeted,
Uh,
incarcerated several times, FBI following him. So, and of course, Nelson Mandela served many years in prison before he became president and did all the good that he did. So, interestingly enough, I grew up extremely poor. My family was on welfare.
where did you grow
And
up?
I was born in Chicago, grew up in Los Angeles, and ended up moving to a small southwestern Michigan town for high school and college.
And when you were growing up, first of all, tell us that you said you were poor growing up. Tell us about your family. Were they well educated people, or what did your parents do?
I think I was the first one in my family to go to college and graduate from college, but my father was severely mentally ill, and he and my mother divorced when I was young. That's how I moved from Chicago to Los Angeles, where she took myself and my brother. And at a later time, at the end of middle school or junior high, whatever they call it now, she sent us to live with my father, who was severely mentally ill, institutionalized for paranoid schizophrenic. And the family was on welfare and food stamps all through my high school years. So
And when you were going through those schools in that difficult kind of background of not having enough food to eat and maybe not having clothes that you wanted to wear and other challenges, what were your aspirations in school? You must have been a really good student? Were you self-directed, self-disciplined? Tell us about your commitment to education.
I was an extremely good student. I was lucky to have a photographic memory. You're blessed with that. You don't. And I also developed an extremely hard work ethic. So I've met a lot of people who have suffered through poverty in their life. And my situation growing up was as severe as most of those. When you say not enough food, spaghetti noodles with ketchup is an example. Clothes from the churches where you would have to sew them up every day so you could wear them without holes in school. So having been there, um, I developed both an empathy to help people and a strong work ethic because in order to survive, I had to work so I could have any access to anything.
And did you have an idea? So you were a great student. Did you have an idea about when it came time to go to college, about where you wanted to go to school or what you wanted to study? Or is that something that evolved kind of just by happenstance?
Well, my father pushed me to be a lawyer. Actually, I was a musician when I was younger, and that really was what I wanted to do. But I ended up at a small college in Michigan, in Western Michigan, that was very wealthy. And my classmates, some of them were the children of some of the literally household name companies and extremely wealthy. And I was the poorest student at the school because I had a friend who worked in financial aid. And my junior year told me I was on more financial aid at the school than any other student. Um, so uh, still had the musical aspirations, but was thinking about law school. And part of the problem was that the poverty had driven me to sort of veer away from music because many musicians suffer for a long time. And of course, many talented musicians never make it. So I was driven more towards law as a way to make sure that to escape the poverty. So I've been thinking about it. One of the books I remember reading when I was 13 was F. Lee Bailey, the great American lawyer who died recently. The Defense Never Rests. So I became very interested in that, but also very interested in civil rights. I studied William Kunstler, who defended the Chicago Seven from the Democratic Convention in 1968. And I developed an extremely liberal attitude at that time regarding the justice system. Now, what's interesting is that while I was an undergraduate, I did an internship in Philadelphia in the homicide division of the state attorney's office. And I like to say I went in a flaming liberal and left believing in the electric bleachers. I'm not sure that's what anybody wants to hear here, but I had the opportunity to firsthand witness being involved in helping prepare cases, extreme acts of violence, terrible acts of violence. So while I truly believe that most of the people listening to this probably shouldn't be where they are, and I honestly believe that, I also believe that there is evil in the world, and that has to be dealt with to protect the rest of people. So that's where I developed during college. So initially I thought I was going to be a prosecutor. And when I came out of law school, I was more geared towards defense, and I went into defense work. And living in Florida, when I moved here in 1979, it was an extremely racist place. And unbelievably, for example, the state headquarters of the Ku Klux Klan were just north of Clearwater, Florida, a huge building. And the justice system was very biased, very racially motivated. So I took a stand against that and began a belief, an absolute hate of racism, and especially the use of the justice system to overwhelm people who did not have even odds.
Mm-hmm. And so this is really helpful, I think, for a lesson that I want to kind of share with members of our community. Um, you know, people in prison have to learn from a leader like Phil that doesn't make excuses about where he comes from. He recognized instead that he bears the responsibility. If he doesn't like eating spaghetti noodles with ketchup, it's incumbent upon him to figure out a way that he could bring value to the lives of other people. And he cited a lot of the same role models that we use in our introductory course with Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King, Viktor Frankl, so many other people who went through challenges not because they did something wrong, just the circumstances of their environment. And yet what I think they have in common with Phil and with any leader that we bring onto this program is that people recognize the importance of personal accountability and personal responsibility. And he surrounded himself with leaders, not only including the famous singer, Tony Bennett, but then used those, through those relationships, met really iconic, world-class civil rights people, with Coretta Scott King and William Kunstler. These are people that we should all strive to emulate, because they are people that really understand what it means to live in the world as it exists and not as we want it to be. And that's what our whole course is about, and that's why I'm so grateful to you, Phil, for sharing that backstory. You said that after undergrad school, you went. Where did you go to law school? And when you were in law, after you had those, were those internships when you were working for the DA, or were you actually working there as an attorney?
That was an internship in undergrad. Mm-hmm. I went to law school at Stetson University College of Law, which currently has one of the strongest trial advocacy programs. It's in St. Petersburg, Florida. And I worked full-time while I went to law school because I didn't have any money, and that was how I lived. So I worked in the insurance business. I was the only one I knew who worked full-time while going to law school. I came up with a way to approach the classes where I could maximize my time, yet still make a living. And I got married near the end of law school and had an obligation to help support my wife. So, and I want to add something here. When I took these actions, one of the things I've never said is, why is me, or woe is me? I knew exactly what I was doing, Michael. I was poking the bear. So, for example, one of the first cases I took was a woman who had been falsely imprisoned, and she did 25 years for murder of an abusive husband. And she was defending herself. Now, today, that would never have happened. But it turns out during a rehearing on her case, well before I got involved, the judge was drunk on the bench, and it was well known to everybody. And so I'd met with the former prosecutor, who was now in private practice and later became a judge. And he told me the story about how the judge called them up to the bench one time during the hearing and asked them if they were seeing the little blue shoes flying around the courtroom. These are in documents that I filed.
Hmm.
So it turned out the entire judiciary at the time, and this is a long time ago, knew that this judge was an alcoholic and were covering for her. Like if she was too drunk to work, they would cover her. Somebody else would step in and take her calendar instead of doing anything to seek rehab help or help. And so when I learned this, I filed a petition with the Supreme Court of Florida that said the entire sitting judiciary in that city needed to be examined because they were letting the judge get away with this, and they all knew about it. And I remember a comment. I hadn't been practicing a year when a well-known defense attorney who knew me, I told him about this, and his exact quote was, "You don't want to be a lawyer very long, do you?" And he was pretty right on, because that's eventually what happened. So I can't sit here and tell you that. I will tell you I poked the bear, and there did come a time when I thought it was over, and it wasn't. But what happens is, and I talk to so many people who don't stand up for themselves, and of course in the federal system they encourage you not to stand up for yourself, uh, and that's how so many people who are in prison shouldn't be there. uh, and I always said, if half the people who are charged with things went to trial, the whole system, not even a half, if 10% went, the system would be so bogged down, they'd have to stop the stupidity of what they're doing. So I think what happens is when you push back, uh, the government pushes back, and the government's big and they have a lot of resources. But I always felt I had an obligation for people who were disadvantaged and maybe didn't have the opportunities I had, not through income or family support, but through education and great role models for working, uh, to help them. So I think anybody who's watching this, or you're teaching and you've done amazing things, is they can achieve whatever they want to achieve. I read a story once that Bill Gates wanted to become an expert, and I don't remember the subject. It might have been biochemistry. Bill Gates, of course, the founder of Microsoft. And so he bought all these books and he immersed himself in it and became an expert in that area. And I learned from that anybody can become an expert in something. You don't have to go to college. You don't have to get a PhD, just through the great resources of self-study.
That's one of the challenges that people in prison have, and that's is that they don't get that message, Phil. So you've just given them a great piece of information that we're always trying to share, is that even if there are no classrooms, even if there are no books, we are bringing these lessons in that will help you accomplish these goals that include developing your vocabulary, developing your writing skills, developing your your verbal communication skills, developing your critical thinking, your work ethic, and all of those things together can help you succeed regardless of what you pursue. And those are not only lessons that we offer in the courses, but they're lessons that we hear from masters like Phil. Is it okay, Phil, if I turn a little bit more to this interesting entrepreneurial venture that you had? Because a lot of the people in prison will, or very few of the people in prison, I think, will aspire to go on to become a lawyer, or maybe even to poke the bear. But what they can really listen and learn from is, how do you build a business? And I find that very interesting that you said you started off working while you were going to law school, and you worked in the insurance industry, but then took what you learned as a part-time employee, I presume, because you were a full-time student,
Right.
and then take that to extraordinary heights and becoming one of the leading brokers, I think you said, or sales professionals in the nation?
Well, so I knew that in order to create a great income, you had to become a great salesperson. And for anybody who's listening, salespeople are not born. Um, I mean, there are actors who are born like Rob Lowe or Brad Pitt because they're unbelievably handsome. But salespeople are not born. Anybody listening to this can become a great salesperson. Absolutely.
And what does it
And
take to be a great salesperson?
there's only one thing is the key thing, which is rarely taught. It is communication, the art of communication.
And that's something that anybody can do. And what are, the building blocks of an education are really just learning how to put words into sentences and sentences into paragraphs. And I think that old cliche says, you have one mouth and two ears, and so you got to listen twice as much as you talk. And that's what I'm trying to do while I'm listening to Phil right now. I always say I'll never ask somebody to anybody to do anything I'm not doing. And you can see this is what I'm trying to do every day. I'm trying to learn from masters, and it's what I want you to be doing as well. So you start off. Tell us how you got started in insurance.
I went and got a license and worked for an agency, and it was hard. There's a tremendous amount of rejection, a very small success rate in the insurance industry. But there's a lot of sales jobs are hard. If you sell cars, it's hard. If you sell real estate, it's hard. If you sell copiers, it's hard, because all sales revolve around rejection. There used to be a saying that if you call 100 people and the first 90 tell you no, it's great news. You're down to somebody who's going to tell you yes. If 1 out of 100 are going to tell you yes, you're down to that last 10. So the first thing is it's hard, and there's rejection, and it can be ego deflating. So the people who become great salespeople and successful have an intuitiveness about sticking to it. They do not, the rejection is never personal. So if somebody's out there listening and wants to become a great salesperson, man or woman, when somebody tells you no, they're not personally rejecting you. They may not understand that they have a need for the product. They may not have a need for the product. It could be the wrong prospect. But it is all about the art of communication. So when I try and teach people about communication, and by the way, there are just superb books and tapes and videos of people teaching you to be a communicator. When I try and teach people, it's a way of reaching people, is communicating. If you're a salesperson, it's not just about knowing your product or how great the product is, but it's about how it can help the person that you're trying to reach. So for example, if you're selling for a landscape company and you knock on my door and I say, well, I can't use your services because my HOA takes care of everything, that's not a good prospect. I'm not rejecting you personally. But anybody can do this. It always helps if they're selling something that they love. Now, very few people love insurance, even the great people selling it. But there are people who love cars. As a musician, I've dealt with people who sell guitars, and they love what they do because they're a guitar player. They're working for a great company. So if it's something that excites you, that you love, that's wonderful. If you love real estate, whatever it is, if you love computers or you love software, but it's always about communication. So many people, you do not have to be well formally educated to be able to communicate. Here's an example. I would ask somebody to think back on an experience where they were in a restaurant and the waiter or waitress was just outstanding. And they thought, what a terrific person. Well, that's a person, and by the way, before I went to law school, I worked myself through undergrad as a waiter. And I learned tremendous communication skills at that. And it was a fun job. So those are people who know how to communicate.
So
And
yeah, I want to bring one thing in there and relate it to our course that you'd said. Is it sometimes it's hard to get a sale, and you've got to be positioned to deal with rejection and people and object people who object to what you're pitching. Well, if you're in prison, you should be a master of that. You should be used to being people telling you no, and it'll never happen, and you've got nothing coming. That's one of the advantages. Use that as a training tool, because when you come home, you will find that to be multiplied by a factor of 100, and yet you still have to be persistent, as Phil just described. So this time of living in prison really can become an exceptional training ground if you could figure out, how do I maintain that super powerful mindset that even when the system is continuously telling me no, or I've got nothing coming, I keep pushing forward. And you're going to have to do this if you're locked in a special housing unit right now and working through these kinds of courses, listening or reading, be thinking about, how could I be more like Phil, and string words into sentences and paragraphs so that I can convince people to see my perspective. Because as he said, some people may not just see it as you see it. And your job is to keep trying and keep working. And words are the building blocks that allow you to do that. But please continue.
well, it's interesting. I was lucky enough to meet somebody uh, over 20 years ago who was an expert in what's called neuro-linguistic programming. And went to school with the founders of that. And it's all about the use of words and how words convey the message. So if you think about it, you can say something to somebody that you don't mean to be sarcastic, but if the tone's wrong, they'll take it that way. And so it all becomes your use of words and how you feel about people. So great salespeople, or good salespeople, or even regular salespeople, they like people. They're enjoying what they're doing, and they have that ability to communicate. Now, that's also from the studies I've done. Uh, the ability to communicate with your loved ones and your friends is also very, very important. Obviously, in the prison environment, the ability to communicate with the case manager or other inmates becomes very, very important, in addition to the people on the outside you're dealing with. But if you can communicate, then and anybody can communicate. So, for example, I once defended a gentleman who was very young, and at the time he was a thug. Uh, and he was involved with his brother and a few other people, and really a small gang. And he was charged with something he didn't do. I got him off. And then later he turned his life around. And today, very successful businessman, very well dressed, very well spoken. And if I were to introduce him to you and tell you his history, you would have a hard time believing that
Well,
because of his improvement.
And speaking, going back to what you'd said earlier about Martin Luther King and words and how powerful they can become. I remember being in prison and reading the letter from the Birmingham jail, and how eloquent he was in communicating a message that at that time in the country there were a lot of people that didn't want to hear. But he never gave up, and he was willing to pay the price, just like we heard Phil was willing to pay the price for what he believed in. If you can define success in your life, and even if you're in a jail cell, even if you're in prison, if you could define, how am I going to emerge from here? How am I going to get started in my life so that I can live with my dignity intact and with opportunities to live a life of meaning and relevance and fulfillment? If you could figure that out, you could start building your plan. And that plan should begin with developing your communication skills, because you're going to need it. You're going to need those skills to raise the resources, to find customers, to persuade people to believe in you, even if you've got the scarlet letter of a felony conviction as I have. And so that's why I'm very grateful whenever I get an opportunity to listen to a leader, because this is what I would have learned while I was in prison, is I can never give up. And even if the prison system doesn't offer me classes, I could always work on developing myself. And Phil, so I'd still like you to get into we have about a half an hour left. These courses only last about an hour, so we have about a half an hour left. And I think it's really, it will be very helpful for our students to learn the steps that you took to actually build a business. So we know that you learned how to communicate, you learned how to face rejection, you learned how to overcome objections, all with the art of communication. But what did it take to actually build a business that you employed other people?
Well, one of the things is I always looked at everything mathematically, but what I did is when I met somebody who knew more than I did, and still that happens every day. And here's an example talking to you in your area, you know more than anybody.
Only about serving time in prisons. People
Yeah.
thought that people don't need to learn about.
I would suck their brain dry for knowledge. So what I realized when I was selling was learning that the hardest part about this was prospecting, finding the right person for your goods or services. And so I realized that when companies would hire you, they would just tell you, go knock door to door, go cold call, go do that. And that's not an effective way to be a great salesperson. So what I did then is when I met somebody who had knowledge of either sales or knowledge of marketing, I literally would spend hours talking to them, writing down everything they say and learning it. Now, the interesting part about this is there's no limit to books on marketing. There's also pretty much no limit to books on sales, but more on marketing. So the key there when you're building your business is assuming you have a product that people want, you have to be able to bring in prospects, because otherwise it's very hard for yourself or other people to sell. There's more rejection. You have large turnover. And I learned things over the years that I wish I'd have done differently years ago. And I think the most important thing I learned was to take care of the people I hired to come work with me. That the most important people were those people, not the customers, because if you took great care of your employees, they take great care of your customers. And that was the most important thing I learned.
Yeah, and that you're giving us some good guidance here that I'm going to ask you to drill down a little bit further on. And you'd spoken about two different verticals, two different areas, sales and marketing. You also mentioned prospects, and it would be helpful, I think, for some of people in our audience to hear from a leader who really differentiates the difference between marketing and sales. How do you define the difference between the two, and what makes a person a good marketer and what makes a person a good salesperson? Are those skills, what's similar, what's different? Any insight you could give on those two areas would be helpful.
Well, here's something interesting. Most people, I was recognized, still am, as the top marketer in the insurance industry. Most people who are in sales do not necessarily know about marketing, which led to a lot of opportunities. And most people who are in marketing do not really know about sales, even though it leads to it. So there's two purposes of marketing. The first can be brand building. When you think of that, you think of Coca-Cola or Bud Light or Walmart. You're building a brand. And the next is direct marketing, where you're looking for a prospect. That's what most of us would be involved in, for a prospect who would have a need for your product. And so you have to drill down and identify, and it's really not that difficult, who would buy your product. For example, I have a relative who left the insurance industry and got into selling pools and pool maintenance. Now in Florida, a huge number of people have pools. The prospect pool is for pools is unbelievable. And in a short time, he's built an extremely successful business through referrals and through just asking because there's such a large need for the service. And that brings me back to the most important thing about sales that even great salespeople miss, which is asking for help, asking for referrals. So, for example, if you meet somebody who doesn't need your product, you might say, "Do you know anybody who does?" Or if you've taken them on as a customer, if I do a good job, do you mind giving me some people who might be able to use my services? And that's hard for a lot of people to do because they don't like asking for help. But the interesting part about this is, as you found out, is people generally want to help people. That's very true.
Well,
So,
there's some takeaways in what you just said that I will say what I would have heard when I was in prison and learned from that is marketing seems to be that level of communication, broader communication that just brings people into the funnel, narrows or maybe crystallizes the prospects that a salesperson is going to talk to. That was one lesson I took. And then the sale, of course, is taking them across the finish line to close the deal. But what was really powerful for me, that what Phil just said, and would have made it important to me if I was in prison, is that analogy he just gave of the guy who was in insurance and then he went into the pool business. And what did he do? Regardless of what sector, you can't get in much more different of a sector than selling insurance and installing swimming pools. But regardless of where you are, you need to have a good marketing plan, including asking for help, and you need to know how to close deals and bring business across the table. Doesn't matter if you're going to start a landscaping company, a pool company, a car detailing company. The lessons we're learning from Phil right now, I would have learned in prison, would have applied to me regardless of what I am doing. And maybe you could elaborate a little bit more on that, Phil.
well, sure. If you think about it, for example, I have a friend who used to be in the heating and air conditioning business in Michigan, and he sold his business. Well, in Michigan, heating, that's very much in demand. Now, in Florida, not very much in demand, but air conditioning. Because one of the worst things that can happen here to someone is their air conditioning breaks down in the summer and it becomes a huge need. So people who sell and build companies for air conditioning systems or sale of that become very successful. One of my most successful friends I knew had built a plumbing company. And he was a plumber and had several plumbers working for him. And he was more successful than most lawyers and doctors I knew because everybody needs a plumber. So when you think about this, it has to be within the range of where you're located or what you're doing. Uh, if you love food, for example, opening a restaurant's very expensive, but having a food truck is nowhere near as expensive and can lead to that kind of success. So you're right. You've boiled it down right, Michael, that in terms of marketing, your goal is to bring you in the people who you can present and might have a need for your goods and services. I actually have a great example, if you want me to give it,
No,
of an
please.
example market.
Your voice and experience and wisdom is the kind of information I would have wanted to learn from while I was locked in special housing units and trying to figure out. I was in prison, Phil, for so long. 9,500 days, and the only thing I ever thought about is how am I going to earn a living when I come home. And I really documented well all the different ways that I trained for that. But it's really like listening to people like you. And I definitely want to hear your story, but I want to relate that story of the plumber that you just gave because a lot of people in prison, they go through this mindset that says, I'm going to be a plumber when I come home, or I'm going to be a painter, or I'm going to do those things. And that's awesome. There's nothing wrong with pursuing a trade and moving forward in that trade. But if that plumber who Phil said is more successful than most lawyers and others is very likely because he learned to do a lot more than glue pipes together and drill holes in wood and put pipe through the woods and run plumbing in the house. He also learned how to communicate with customers. He learned how to get sales. He learned how to manage people. He learned how to negotiate with vendors and suppliers and generate capital that would be necessary to build a line of credit so that he could get bigger jobs. He learned how to read blueprints. All of those are skills that will make you way more valuable in the marketplace and change your life from earning, $50 or $75 an hour as a plumber to earning, $50,000 a week or $75,000 a week in sales. And those are very big differences. And that is the message I would have gotten in that analogy from Phil's story about the plumber. But you have another story, and I can't wait to hear it.
Well, for example, one of the things that I teach people is, you talk about, and Justin talks about being extraordinary and standing out. There's ways for people to do this coming out that they're not thinking about. And for example, there's a great story from one of the first people to write a book on sales, Joe Girardi. I think the book was titled How to Sell Anything to Anybody. Joe Girardi was the world's greatest car salesman. And the story was he was married. He got a job selling cars. He was broke. And it was, I think, either Thanksgiving or Christmas Eve. He had a baby. He had no money for food. And they let him walk the lot, but they wouldn't even stand it. People who came in, he couldn't take turns. And near the end of the evening, somebody came in, and I think it was blizzardy weather, and nobody else approached him. So Joe approached him, and Joe sold him a car and literally got, when none of the other salespeople had talked to him, an advance so he could buy food. Speaking of which, I know it's not on track, but I have to tell you a story of the worst thing I ever saw in the criminal justice system.
Okay.
I was defending a person who was on violation of probation in an area of Florida, I'll just say is very rednecky. And the first guy got up, he was African-American, and he had left his rehab, and the judge gave him 12 years. And my guy had been on probation for assaulting a police officer. And I thought, we have a problem. The second guy gets up, and this is a true story. I call it the Tiny Tim. He had been on probation for a felon in possession. And Christmas Eve, he had no food in the house. He had 2 young children. His father was dying of cancer. And he went to Albertsons and he stole a ham and some fruit so he could feed his family. He was arrested for it, and the judge gave him 5 years in prison.
Sounds like that French story, Les Miserables, stole the loaf of bread.
The worst thing I ever saw, then my guy went up and he went home with me. My guy didn't go in because he had me. But the idea here is, if you offer the people listening to this to do something for somebody above and beyond, for example, let's say that you're selling landscaping services and you're going in a neighborhood where they need it. You might say to the person, what I'm willing to do is to do your lawn, your garden for a month at no charge. And if you're happy, I would ask you to hire me. And if you're not happy, then you got a month's free work for nothing. Now, so what I'm going to say to people here is the power of the word free is amazing. So somebody listening to this might say, well, Phil, I don't want to do work for free. Nobody wants to do work for free. But free becomes a loss leader. If whatever your service is, you can offer it to them where they do not feel that they're obligated, because they're not, your career will grow exponentially. And whatever it is you want to do, if you want to be a chef, you give them a tasting. Think about the time when you walk around the mall, there used to be food courts, and people would come out from the food court and have trays of food and let you taste them. People love free. So as part of your plan, whatever it is you want to do, go above and beyond. If you want a job with somebody, and let's say they don't want to hire you, and you say, you know what? I want to work for you so bad. Can I work for you for free for a month? Can I intern and show you how valuable I can be? And that's easy to say because somebody's listening, go, well, Phil, I got to have groceries and I got to pay the electric, but you're not going to pay it if you don't have a job anyway. If you are willing to go over and above, you can create great opportunities for yourself.
I can't tell you how valuable it is what you just said, because in the course itself, the introductory course, that we give that same lesson. And it says that while you're in prison, you already do have this, you've got your clothes, you've got your food, you're sleeping in a place. This is the time to start investing in yourself by reaching out beyond the prison and trying to find leaders, people like Phil. In the analogy in the course, it is that exact story. I'm writing I recommend they have a course, Phil, where that tells them, write a letter to an employer, say exactly what you said. My name is Michael Santos. I've been in prison for 25 years. I'm going to get out in a year. And if that turns you off, you can throw this letter away. But here's my value to you. I would like to work for you for free for 2 weeks. And if I'm not the hardest working guy there, first guy to come, last guy to leave, most concerned about your customers and the other people on your team, then I'm going to shake your hand and thank you for the opportunity. But if you find me worthy, I'm just asking for a shot. And that, you've gone through our course and you heard that, but now you heard it from Phil. So you're listening, and I didn't coach him to say that, but that's the same lesson that we both gave. It's because I learned these lessons when I was in prison from listening to people like Phil. That's what all successful people have in common. He mentioned that story earlier about Bill Gates wanting to be something else. He didn't remember what it was, but there's an author, Malcolm Gladwell, who wrote this book called Outliers, and he spoke about being 10,000 hours.
Here you go.
There
you
it
go,
is.
Michael.
Outliers.
Right on the shelf.
Right? Being
Yeah.
working for 10, if you want to be an expert at something, invest 10,000 hours. Well, when I was in prison, I had about 10,000 days, and I spent all of those days spending my hours working to listen and learn from leaders like Phil. And that's why I'm so grateful to him for coming into our class. He's got a lot of things going on in the world, running businesses. And when I reached out and said, look, I communicate with hundreds of thousands of people in prison, and we need to work together to try and change their life. Not only did he volunteer to come and share his story and his wisdom, but also to work with me in developing the course itself. And Phil, we're kind of coming to the end of our lesson because the prison kind of controls the amount of time we have. Maybe you could give us another message that you would give to somebody who might be serving 5 years or 10 years. What suggestions might you offer to that person on what he could be doing while he's inside that might accelerate or open opportunities for him when he comes home?
Well, first of all, anybody doing that, my heart goes out to you. But I would tell you that if you can, whatever field you're interested in, if you can reach out and get as much material as you can, either through the library, if you have a loved one who can Google it or go to Amazon and send you books on it, or magazines, or whatever material you have that you can learn from, that is tremendous. And the fortunate thing is there's so much material to learn from. None of us are going to live long enough to read it all. But I'll give you a great example here of where success in Hollywood comes. I have a lot of friends who are in Hollywood. So I have a friend who started out as a bodyguard. He had been a Marine for a household name actress. And he became very close to her, and then he became her assistant. And then through that assistant, when she was on the movie, he met one of the biggest movie stars in the world. Not going to mention the name, and he became close friends with him. And then through that, he became his partner in his production company. So what happens this is from the start of a bodyguard. What happens in the Hollywood business is many people who end up in positions of success and financial and he ended up telling me a story where he went to a New Year's Eve party and there was a dinner with 8 people, and 6 of the people there were literally, it wasn't Taylor Swift, but stars who are as big, close to Taylor Swift. One of them as big as Taylor Swift. And I laughed at him and I said, did you feel funny sitting at that table with these people? And he built that opportunity for himself. So the opportunity to achieve these things is still there. Today, the government has painted so many people, Democrat or Republican, with the scarlet letter that I don't think it has the same stigma that it used to. But what you can achieve, I believe, anything you want to achieve, you just have to put your mind to it, put your resources to it, and work to that effect. That's what I would tell you while you're in there. I would learn and study. And if you're in with somebody who knows a specific area, I would get as much knowledge from them as possible if that's an area you're interested in.
And even if you don't have somebody that's right next to you because you might be locked in a special housing unit, do the same thing that we teach in our course. Pick up one of these pieces of technology here, a pen, and write a letter. You could write a letter to a leader like Phil, just like I did. Just reach out. Hey, my name is Michael Santos. I'd really like to learn from you. And I read about you in this article, or I saw this class, and it would be really helpful for me to develop a skill because I really want to be more effective in sales, right? Send one letter out, you might not get an answer. Send 100 letters out, you've got a better chance of getting an answer. And that is also great training for a career in sales because you've got to be ready to face rejection. You've got to be ready to do hard things. You've got to do them over and over again. Be persistent. And it doesn't matter what sector you go, whether we heard him talk about Hollywood, we heard him talk about plumbing, we heard him talk about insurance. All of these are predicated on success, and all of these are predicated on an individual's ability to communicate. And that's what we think you should be doing while you're in prison. Phil, I really want to thank you for spending time with us today. You've done a lot in your life, and when I told you I wanted to just have you communicate with our team, you volunteered, and that means a lot to us. That's why we're now going to commend you with an honorary. You're now a prison professor.
Well, thank you. That means actually is very humbling, and that means a lot to me. Thank you so much, Michael.
Phil, I'll tell you that these people that we're connecting with, they live a lot of times without hope. You'd mentioned earlier about being extraordinary and compelling. These are not our words. Those are the words that you will hear or you will read if you read Supreme Court cases on matters like compassionate release or executive clemency or resentencing. You want to be able to demonstrate that you've built an extraordinary and compelling release plan. And part of it should be, giving credit to leaders like Phil. When you read it, go through a course like this, you might want to mention in your work, in your description, this is what I learned from listening to these types of leaders. They help me recognize I can't wait for the government to change my life. I got to be a lot more Martin Luther King-esque and write my own letters from the Birmingham jail and talk about this is where I see injustice and this is what I want to change. Do this in your own life and opportunities will open. And Phil, I just want to thank you again for spending time with us today and also for spending time with me in developing the written lesson that becomes a part of this course. What we ask our people in our community is please go through those lessons, learn from those lessons, and make sure that you let us know what you learned from Phil. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Michael.